Today we are going to the early 20th century, so sit back as we go to the USA. Ruth Brown Snyder was born on March 27, 1895, in Manhattan. Her parents had come to New York from Scandinavia. Her mother, Josephine, was from Sweden, and her father, named Henry Sorensen, was from Norway. Henry changed his name to Brown, as he thought it would be easier now he was living in America. The family were considered nice, respectable people, and every day Henry would go to work, while Josephine took care of the couple's 2 children. He was a carpenter, and although there was a lot of work for him, the wages were low, and the family were relatively poor. So Ruth and her elder brother rarely experienced the finer things in life. Ruth attended school, and although she tried her best, she was no academic. So when she was old enough to leave, she did, and she found a job as a telephonist at a New York telephone company. She was assigned the night shift and found the work monotonous, but she was young and eager to get on. So in order to increase her chances of finding a different job, she took classes in business and shorthand in the afternoons. Ruth was determined to make a better life for herself than the one that she had experienced during her childhood. These were exciting times for a young American girl. Many people had cars, the New York subway was operational, and with the rapid industrial and technological advancements, there were more opportunities available in the workplace. Despite all the advancements, Ruth still managed to make a very elementary mistake. One day, while working on the telephone switchboard, she dialed the wrong number, and instead of calling a manufacturing company, she called a man named Albert Snyder. Albert was an intelligent man, and he worked as the editor of a magazine named Motorboating. But he had recently suffered tragedy in his life when his fiancée, named Jess Gizzard, died of pneumonia. He had been engaged to her for 10 years, but they had never married. When Ruth accidentally phoned him, he was not very pleased and took all of his frustrations out on the young telephone operator. Ruth apologised, and eventually Albert calmed down and told her that he was very sorry for his reaction. Feeling quite guilty, he said that he would like to apologise in person, and the next day he went to her work to offer a personal apology. He was instantly captivated by her and started to meet her before she started work. A few weeks after they first met, Albert arranged for Ruth to work at his magazine as a reader and copyist. He could now see the pretty 19-year-old every day, and before long, they started going out. Although Albert was physically attracted to Ruth, he soon realised that they didn't share the same interests. Ruth paid no attention to current affairs, never read a book, and only seemed interested in settling down and becoming a wife. Eventually he asked her to marry him, and Ruth became Mrs. Ruth Brown Snyder. At first their marriage was okay. Ruth had found a man who had a good job, a steady income, and a nice house, and shortly after they married, Ruth found out that she was pregnant. She was very happy, but Albert didn't share her excitement. He had never got over the death of his previous fiancée, and he kept a picture of her in his home, and whenever Ruth moved it, he would put it back. It was as if there were 3 people in the marriage, and one of them was dead. The couple's baby was born on the 15th of November 1917, and they named her Lorraine. So now a father, Albert continued to work hard, and as the magazine sales increased, so did his income. Eventually he moved his family to Queens Village in Long Island. For Albert, the move showed that he had been successful in business, but for Ruth, the journey into a suburban lifestyle was difficult to adapt to. She amused herself by keeping an immaculate house and taking her daughter to school, and from the outside it seemed that she had everything anyone would want, but Ruth felt lonely and isolated. In 1925, her father died, and Albert suggested that her grieving mother move in with them. Albert now spent more time away from his wife, and when he was home, he preferred to stay in the garage working on his car or in his garden rather than with his family. It seemed that the couple's relationship was going downhill. There was a 12-year age gap between them, and the energetic Ruth was disappointed that her husband was not more outgoing. But Albert was equally frustrated, but his wife was too fun-loving and didn't take things seriously enough. He wished she was more like his deceased fiancée, and he didn't mind telling her. It was a pity, he said, but Ruth couldn't be more like Jess. Ruth's mother could see that there were problems in the marriage and advised her daughter to seek a divorce. But Ruth didn't want to do that. She knew that financially she was in a very good position and instead decided to seek other ways to amuse herself. With her mother now living in her home, Ruth had a very trustworthy childminder. So with her husband at work and her mother taking care of Lorraine, she started to go out and socialise during the day. She was rumoured to spend time with different men, but in 1925, she met a corset salesman named Henry Judd Gray, who everyone referred to as Judd. Like her husband, Judd was older than Ruth. He was originally from Cortland in New York and was born in 1882. He was married to a very nice lady named Isabel, who had been his childhood sweetheart, and they had a daughter. He was known as a reliable and honest person who helped his neighbours, attended church, and ran errands for his elderly mother. Ruth and Judd seemed to hit it off from the start. They were both discontented with their home life, and the mid-1920s were progressive times. Women had been given the vote in 1919, and the Charleston was a craze in the dance halls and the music theatres. They started to meet, at first for lunch or coffee, but somewhat inevitably, their relationship grew until they started having an affair. They usually met in hotels where they registered as Mr. and Mrs. Gray. They became such a frequent visitor to one that they kept a small suitcase in a hotel locker. As the relationship got more intense, Ruth told Judd of her problematic marriage and how her husband pays her no attention, preferring to look at a photo of his deceased fiancée than talk to her. She wanted to be free of him so she could have a more exciting life. The couple then started discussing ways of how Ruth could rid herself of her husband. The problem that Ruth and Judd had was that they were not criminals. She was a housewife and he was a corset salesman, but nevertheless, they devised a plan. Ruth took out a series of life insurance policies on her husband. These were for varying amounts, ranging from $1,000 to $48,000, with the largest one paying double if the death occurred due to an unexpected act of violence. On the 19th of March, 1927, Ruth's mother was away for the weekend, so they decided to put their plan into action. They went into Manhattan and purchased a 5-pound weight, some chloroform, and lengths of picture wire. Later that evening, Albert, Ruth, and their daughter Lorraine went to a neighbour's house for a small party. Albert had a few drinks, and Ruth managed to put some powder in his glass, which would make him fall asleep quicker. While the family were at the neighbour's house, Judge entered Ruth and Albert's property through a door that Ruth had left open. With him he had the items they had purchased earlier in the day. Now inside, he calmly waited for the family to return. Eventually, at 2 a.m, they came back, and not feeling too good, Albert made his way upstairs to bed. Moments later, Ruth and Judd went upstairs and entered the bedroom. They looked at Albert sleeping, and Judd picked up the weight and struck him in the head with it. However, he did not do this with very much conviction or force, and Albert suddenly woke up and started to fight back. Judd panicked. This was not part of their plan, but quick-thinking Ruth managed to resolve the situation by smothering Albert with a cloth that was soaked in chloroform, and he eventually lost consciousness. They then placed a cloth over his face, and Albert Snyder died due to suffocation. The second part of their plan was to make the scene look like a robbery, and when they finished arranging everything, Judd tied Ruth's hands and feet to a chair and put a cloth in her mouth, and then he left the property. Ruth then just waited for her daughter to wake up. When she did, the young girl removed the gag from her mother's mouth and ran to the neighbour's house. Alarmed, the neighbours immediately rushed to Ruth's aid and then called the police. After the police arrived, they inspected the scene and spoke to Ruth. She claimed that 2 Italian men had broken into her house and knocked her unconscious. They had tied her up and left her in the hallway. When she was untied, she had realised that they had stolen her jewellery. The police, however, noticed that the burglars had left little evidence, and they were puzzled as to why she showed little emotion for a woman who had been terrorised and whose husband had just been murdered. They also spoke to her daughter Lorraine, who told them that her mummy and daddy were always arguing. The police took Ruth to the station for questioning and conducted a forensic search of the house. Officers didn't believe anything that she was telling them, and as they continued to interrogate her, officers at the Snyder home continued to search for clues. They soon came across jewellery hidden under a mattress, which looked very much like the items that Ruth had told them had been stolen. They also discovered a £5 weight in the basement and an address book, which they presumed belonged to Ruth. It contained the names of 28 men. They also found on the floor of the bedroom a small pin with the initials JG on it. The pin had belonged to Albert, and the initials were of his deceased fiancée, Jess Gishard. The police, however, unaware of this, matched the initials to a man in the address book named Judd Gray. They asked Ruth about the man with the initials JG, and thinking that they had arrested him, she asked if he had confessed, which the officer replied, "Indeed he has." Ruth then made a full confession, claiming Judd was the architect of the crime. A few hours later, Henry Judd Gray was arrested at a hotel in Syracuse and was transported to New York for questioning. He insisted he was innocent and had a manufactured alibi, as a friend had rented a room at a hotel under his name. But on investigation, this alibi was undermined when the police found his discarded train ticket in the rubbish bin. He then made a full confession, blaming Ruth as the one who had orchestrated the whole thing. The police charged both of them with the murder of Albert Snyder. The papers were fascinated with the case and dubbed it the Granite Woman and the Putty Man. Judd took full advantage of the press interest by telling them his story. He claimed he was an ordinary man who had been the victim of an evil woman who had hypnotised and manipulated him. The trial started at the Queens County Courthouse on Long Island in April 1927, and the courtroom was packed. People also waited on the streets outside. Ruth wore a plain black dress and showed humility throughout the trial. Her lawyer told the court how she had been a loving wife and mother and tried hard to repair her broken marriage, but as her husband became more distant, she found comfort in the arms of Henry Judd Gray, a man desperate to find a better life for himself away from his wife, and he came up with a plan to take out insurance policies and do away with Albert. Judd's lawyer painted a very different picture. He knew that public sympathy was with his clients, and he confirmed to the court that Judd was indeed an ordinary man who had been a model citizen before he met Ruth, and that she had callously taken advantage of his weak character, eventually persuading him in assisting her to commit the crime. Judd also told the court that Ruth had tried on many occasions to rid herself of her husband, but each time she failed, and that is why she manipulated him into assisting her. The trial ended on May the 29th, 1927, and the jury was sent out to consider their verdict. 98 minutes later, they returned to find the defendant, Henry Judd Gray, guilty of murder, and the other defendant, Ruth Brown Snyder, guilty of murder, and the judge sentenced both of them to death. They were taken to Sing Sing prison to await their fates. In prison, it was reported that Ruth received 164 offers of marriage from men who either believed that she was innocent and would be granted a retrial, or that her sentence would be commuted. Ruth now occupied her time by writing her memoirs, which were later published in the New York Daily Mirror. She also wrote a letter to her daughter to be opened when she was old enough to understand. On January the 12th, 1928, Ruth Brown Snyder was executed in the electric chair, and this was followed by the execution of Henry Judd Gray. Ruth became the first woman to be executed at Sing Sing prison in the 20th century. A photographer managed to smuggle a camera into the prison, strapped to his ankle, and took a photo as Ruth was in the electric chair. The next day it was printed on the front page of the New York Daily News, and the paper sold all of its copies in 15 minutes. The custody of Lorraine, the daughter of Albert and Ruth, was given to Ruth's mother, Josephine. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As per usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I will see you in the next brief case.